I'm delighted to be able to share with you the first episode of the Utopia podcast, where I speak with Will Turner about one of the most cutting edge carbon removal solutions, namely enhanced weathering. Will is one of the best people to speak about this, with being the lead data scientist at Undo Carbon, which is one of the leading companies actively developing enhanced weathering projects, and which has recently agreed a substantial partnership with Microsoft to fund thousands of tons of carbon dioxide removal. They recently reached the final of the Carbon Removal XPRIZE, funded by the Musk Foundation, which will award $100 million to fund the most effective carbon removal solutions. In the discussion, we go through the basics of what is enhanced weathering, how it works, its strengths, and some of the challenges facing this new form of carbon project. We also talked about the role of carbon credits, the significance of carbon removal more generally in addressing the climate challenge. This episode, I thought, had to be first. It's not just because it's about carbon removal, but enhanced weathering is, of course, one of the leading technologies. It's hugely important solution in the space, and it's not talked about nearly enough. So I think this conversation, it gives a good overview of what enhanced weathering is, and from one of the companies at the forefront of its development. So I hope you enjoy. So Undo Carbon obviously specializes in enhanced weathering, and I thought we might just start by perhaps you giving a brief overview of not even enhanced weathering, but just what is carbon removal for those who haven't heard of it, and why is this important in sustainability?
Yeah, sure. So carbon dioxide removal is as exactly as it sounds. We're removing carbon from the atmosphere and durably storing it for thousands of years. And obviously, we already know that we've got kind of too much carbon in the atmosphere right now, and we're not close to net zero just yet. So we'll need, and all the projections show that we need carbon dioxide removal to meet any of the targets that we've got planned for the next 100 years.
And could you give us a sense of the scale of the challenge? Because people often talk about this, we're not meeting the targets, but how much are we not meeting the targets? Like, how big of a problem is this?
Sure, obviously. So there's two sides to the coin, right? We need to decarbonize and electrify all of civilization, but we also need to remove carbon from the atmosphere. So there's a trade-off there. The longer we take to electrify, the more carbon we'll have to remove. That's just the aim that's just the overall plan. So when we look at some of the projections, by 2050, we'll need to be removing billions of tons annually of carbon from the atmosphere. And obviously, the state of the science at the moment for any carbon dioxide removal pathway is still really early, and we're at the thousands, tens of thousands of tons level. So there's a lot of scaling that's needed. So kind of right on the ground floor at the moment.
Yeah, because our annual um, emissions are something like what, 40 gigatons or something every year, and we'll be needing several gigatons at least per year of
Exactly. Yeah.
removal. So quite a
So it's
substantial proportion of our
a great challenge. Yeah.
current emissions. Brilliant. And could you just give a summary of sort of what is enhanced weathering for those who haven't heard of it?
Sure. So there's a very natural process called weathering, and this has gone on for billions of years on Earth, where kind of exposed rock surfaces of kind of silicate minerals interact with rainwater that contains carbonic acid, which is carbon stored in rainwater. And that reacts with a silicate mineral, and that converts the carbon in the rainwater into a stable bicarbonate ion. And that eventually washes out into the ocean over hundreds of years timescales. But that's a very slow process. And that has, over kind of geologic timescales, that has naturally balanced our climate in the past. But what we do is we mine this silicate mineral, and a lot of the time these minerals are being used for other purposes and are already mined, and we're just taking the byproduct is not financially viable for the company to use at that time. So it's kind of 4 mil or 2 mil down fraction of rock. And what we do is purchase that from the quarry and spread that on farmers' fields, and that massively increases the surface area of rock that's exposed to this chemical reaction. So it's kind of taking this natural process and enhancing it to increase the reaction rate and increase the amounts of carbon that can be sequestered through this process.
So it is literally essentially a type of rock or ground up rock that is being sort of spread as its own thing on fields over quite a large area. Is that a fair
Yes,
summary?
exactly. So it uses existing machinery, it uses lime spreaders that
Mm.
are quite commonplace in agricultural settings. Um, and yeah, it just fits in naturally with farmers' processes that they carry out anyway. And we see when you apply this material, there's an increase in soil pH as well. So it has a liming effect. So yeah, there's kind of crop benefits and soil benefits to this process as well. It's not purely just CDR. There are other co-benefits to this technology.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about some of those. Well, I mean, what are the sort of um, benefits? I mean, it's interesting the comparison with tree planting because that's obviously the sort of classic carbon removal method if that people think of or perhaps are familiar with. What are the sort of advantages are there of this of enhanced weathering?
Sure. So we published a paper probably about a year and a half ago now in uh, collaboration with Newcastle University, where we showed between 10 and 15% crop yield increase on a crop in the UK, where we had applied the basalt. So a
Really?
basalt is a type of silicate mineral. There's different types around the world that you can play with. But yes, we showed a really strong signal of crop yield increase on this at this research farm that we worked with. And these kind of hints are coming up all over the place. So we operate on grassland as well and can see kind of an increase in grass yields. And we're starting some agronomic trials at different parts of the world at the moment where we're kind of expanding into to really see what the kind of local benefits are. But so far, yeah, and yeah, so far there's strong signals of crop yield increase.
And just are there sort of improvements in um, biodiversity more generally, or is it just mainly that sort of crop that you're actually spreading it on?
So one of my favorite papers actually is showing that there's an increase in worm activity when you've applied silicate
Ah,
mineral to an area. Um, but it's kind of still quite early science research that's going on into these different processes. So we're
mm,
still learning a lot about the kind of underlying mechanisms that are at play, but the kind of first order principles are quite basic.
and you touched on it earlier, but obviously one another difference is the permanence of the
Mm.
carbon removal compared to trees, which could be chopped down or, take a long time to absorb the emissions. How does that sort of compare? How long does it take for the emissions to be drawn down, and how permanent is it once they are drawn down?
Yeah, so it depends what kind of silicate mineral you work with. Some dissolve a lot quicker than others, but typically in the 5 to 10 year timescale, the feedstock we've applied will have completely served its purpose, sequestered all the carbon it will during its kind of project life cycle. Then over the next 50 or 100 years, that will wash out into the ocean, and there it will stay for tens of thousands of years as a durable and stable form of carbon removal.
Hmm.
But yeah, as you compare it to some other technologies where that permanence is not quite as guaranteed.
Yeah, I was just looking back at the IPCC report, and I was surprised at how confident it obviously the IPCC International Panel on Climate Change, and it talks about different carbon removal methods, and it seemed that enhanced weathering it listed as having one of the greatest potentials for removing carbon in the sort of gigaton range compared to some of the other ones where it's lower or perhaps only 1 or 2 gigatons per year. Um, do you think, oh, how great, I suppose, do you think the scalability potential is, and
Mm.
particularly, obviously, that you're needing to source this basalt and the rocks from somewhere? Do you foresee there being lots of problems with that, or how scalable do you think it is in that context?
Well, when you look at some of the common feedstocks for carrying out enhanced weathering around the world, people are obviously favoring the fast weathering minerals right now just to get good commercial return from the operations you're carrying out. But coming back to basalts as kind of a medium speed weathering material, basalt is one of the most abundant minerals on Earth. It's kind of found all over the world. So the scalability of the technology is huge just because the feedstock's very, very common. Um, so yeah, it's definitely got the ability to scale to gigaton. That's no question. It's
Mm.
just what time scale can we get there and what cost will that take to get there?
Sure, sure. Um, Now the another sort of potential difficulty with it is obviously it's quite expensive at the moment to do. Um, my understanding is sort of the hundreds of dollars per ton, compared to some other, client projects which are sort of more in the tens of dollars per ton of carbon removed. What's your sort of view on that as a challenge? Do you think that it is a big problem, or or is it something that's going to be sort of fixed quite quickly, I suppose?
Yeah, well, definitely where we find ourselves at the moment is that trying to quantify exactly how much carbon's been removed from the operations that we carry out. It's a very costly process. You've got to do a lot of field measurements, and see they're open systems we're working in with great variation across individual fields, at least. So you've got to take many, many soil samples, and that's a quite costly process. But eventually, you can imagine once we've gained enough knowledge of the process on the ground rather than in a lab setting, we'll definitely be able to build models that can accurately predict, given the type of feedstock and the land it's deployed on, exactly how much carbon will be sequestered at each point throughout time. So once you kind of gained the confidence with the high capital expenditure measurements in the first few years, and then start to kind of roll that back and rely more on models, you could see the price dropping dramatically. And that's where we're hoping to get to as soon as possible.
Interesting, interesting. So it's sort of having that reliability that you know that what you're doing is watertight and it is actually doing what you think it's doing at the sort of scales that you predict it
Exactly.
will.
And we really want to prove out the technology in the most trustworthy and open way possible, because
Hmm.
we can't end up in a situation what we've seen with other carbon removal projects that have turned out to be not as they explained or not as they expected.
Yeah,
So we'd prefer to get this right. And if that costs a lot upfront to do, that's what we're going to have to do. But it's, as you said, it's one of the most scalable technologies. So we've got to get it right, and we can't lose kind of public trust before getting to gigatons.
yeah. I mean, what sort of time frame are you envisaging, do you think, to sort of overcome that initial um unreliability or needing to firm up the evidence?
Um, it's definitely going to take multiple years. This isn't a kind of a take 1 year of measurement and then, you know, rely on models for the future. So we're going to have to be improving our models at the same time as slowly reducing the measurement stack. But you will still need the measurements on the ground to kind of quantify how much you've improved your model and if it's matching reality. Um, Models are famously never perfect. So we'll still need to carry out kind of ground truth measurements throughout time as well. So I would hesitate to put a strong number on it, but it's going to take, yeah,
Sure.
multiple seasons on the ground to really nail it.
Yeah. Are there any other aspects of um enhanced weathering that before we move on, that I haven't sort of touched on that you think are particularly important or make it unique or pose a particular challenge um, of this particular type of carbon removal?
I think this is just something that came to mind. It's not, what my day to day consists of. But when we look at how we play with kind of uh, electricity production around the world, you could imagine, given um, green energy like wind or solar is uh, quite intermittent. You get massive surges of wind power, and if your grid's not up to transferring all that power to another part of the country, you might have to, ramp down production. But what you could
Mm.
imagine enhanced weathering being is like a kind of a um, carbon removal battery, effectively. So when you've got huge amounts of green power on the grid, you can start crushing more rock and you could get it finer and finer and finer using that surplus energy. So the kind of one of the negative points, as you briefly highlighted before, is potentially having to crush rock takes a lot of energy. But if you could kind of reduce the kind of peak production and get it back down to from
Mm.
a baseline using crushers to balance the grid, that would be really cool to see uh, happen all the way around the world. But obviously, we don't need that to be able to scale, but that would be a nice co-benefit of the technology as well. So I don't think many other carbon removal technologies could benefit the grid in that way.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Um, Now, it's my understanding that you would be using the sort of voluntary carbon market or the carbon credit um, means, or if you like, to measure the tons of carbon that are being removed through um, through this method of carbon removal. I wanted to ask just more broadly, like, what do you think about the voluntary carbon market and carbon credits as a means of measurement? I mean, fundamentally, that's what it is, isn't it? A means of measuring 1 ton of carbon. Um, yeah, what are your views on carbon credits?
Um, I favor kind of coming at this from a kind of a scientific lens. I try not to get too kind of dug into the commercial aspects or
Mm,
elements of the technology. So I don't really have strong opinions of voluntary carbon markets or anything like that. I think when you look at a lot of the companies we're working with, they are cutting edge and wanting to fund the science at its current point at the moment. Obviously, they're wanting carbon credits as part of it, but there's a lot of
mm.
companies who don't have to stick their head up and stump up the funds to pay for this technology. So um, yeah, I don't know. I don't have strong feelings either way.
Yeah, yeah. I suppose what's important is, like you say, having the methodologies in place to make sure that you can rely on X amount of carbon being removed,
Hmm.
rather than what you sort of label the credit or the unit. Would that be a better way of putting it?
I guess, yeah, we work with different verification bodies around the world who got their methodologies for renewable ton of carbon removal credit looks like.
Mm.
Um, yeah, and we're yeah pushing forwards with them.
Yeah. Perhaps you could tell us a bit about how um, how successful you've been so far. I know that you've got some um, major clients already. What sort of interest have you had?
Yeah, so it's been really interesting to to work with different kinds of companies from big to small, and
Mm.
all they want to see really is the science progressing for carbon removal. Um, you you can talk to whoever you want at the company, and they're all just interested in the technology. So we've
Yeah,
got some really interesting partnerships with different types of companies. Obviously, the main one being Microsoft, who are the biggest buyer in the world, and they are kind of doing all the right things they can to fund the science and fund all technologies to get to a point where we can rely on carbon removal in the future. And I think they've made strong claims about removing all of their past emissions as well, which I don't think I've heard any other company try and do. So
yeah,
that's very cool. Um, so yeah, it's amazing how much interest there is in the technology, and you talk to someone and they think that sounds like a win-win. Like the farmer wins, the soil gets improved, and there's carbon removal. Like what's not to love? So yeah, it's been interesting to see kind of when it clicks for people, how the technology is kind of got all these different co-benefits as well. It's been yeah, interesting to see.
yeah. It's so interesting. I mean, has that getting that exposure and partnering with Microsoft, has that really helped, do you think, um, give more exposure to enhanced weathering as a particular type of carbon removal more generally, that didn't have before, or
Yeah, definitely. I think as well, kind of having the backing of Microsoft, once you're we do lots of different shows around the world, and when you're talking to someone and trying to convince them that no, this is as good as it sounds. As
Yeah.
soon as you say, and we're partnering with Microsoft to try and progress this technology, then they realize that it is a proper solution and there is yeah, a real benefit here. So yeah, it's definitely a good name to have alongside you.
Yeah. And what sort of operations have you got going on at the moment? What is the sort of the latest expansion that you're
So
looking
yeah,
at?
we're obviously favoring the fast weathering minerals, fast weathering silicate minerals around the world, primarily wollastonite in Canada, um, which has a weathering kind of kinetics that are orders of magnitude quicker than typical basalts that you find around the world. And what we aim to do with this mineral is kind of boost the signal that we hope to see in our in our soil measurements. Um, and once you've got the bigger signal, then you can see what your impact is much easier. And that helps you in lots of different areas. So we're trying to really learn as much as we can about the process with this fast weathering high signal mineral. Um, and obviously, the faster it weathers, the quicker we can sell more credits, which really
So,
underpins the business. So
so are you in the still sort of the testing phase in Canada, or are you implementing that?
we've got a very robust kind of measurement verification um,
Right.
set up around Canada. And yeah, we've spread hundreds, well, tens of thousands of tons of rock in Canada over last year, and we've got ambitions to spread even more this year. So it's kind of transitioning from small scale pilots to large scale spreading, and we've got huge farmer uptake in the area as well. So it's it's been really amazing to see how this pilot project has expanded over the last kind of 12 months to be as big as it is now. And yeah, this underpins our XPRIZE claim as well, which I'm sure we can talk about at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, maybe you could tell us about the X Prize now, actually. That might be a good time.
Sure, yeah. So XPRIZE is they've got many different kind of awards going on at the moment. One of them is this carbon removal award. And what they set out to do, this was kind of at least 4 years ago now. I think they started 4 years ago, something like that, was they wanted to see who around the world has got the best technology for removing carbon from the atmosphere. And at first, we made it to the top 100 after showing kind of how interesting the technology is and our kind of scientific processes at that point in time. Um, and then we made it to the top 20, which meant that we could go into this kind of the final phase of the prize, which was a 1,000 ton removal demonstration, which happened from January 24 to January 25.
Mm.
Um, and during this process, you're reviewed by kind of a reviewer, an independent body who reviews your technology and they visit you on the ground, go through end to end everything that you're doing. And then you have this judges panel where you have some of the top scientific judges from around the world review your process and ask you questions. And we've just wrapped that process now. And we stand waiting till I think it's the 20th of April. We find out who's won this prize. And there's quite a large prize pot. To first prize is about $50 million, which would really catalyze the technology and allow us to scale much quicker, which would be fantastic for the technology. Obviously, there's not just us. There are 19 other companies throughout different removal technologies. Um, so yeah, I'm sure whoever wins will do great things with the money, but we're yeah quite excited by the prospect at least.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure exactly when this will come out, but I'll definitely make sure to include um, information about the X Prize in the notes whenever it does come out. Um, that's really exciting. I think just to sort of wrap up, I just wanted to come back again to this broader question of the importance of carbon removal and maybe just ask you, like on a personal note, what does it mean to you to be doing this and how important do you feel that it is that more generally we invest in these sorts of technologies?
Yeah, sure. So, kind of before joining Undo, I was a kind of research physicist working at the University of Liverpool, and I worked on kind of different particle physics experiments across the world for a number of years. Um, and I just couldn't get out of my head the fact that we had all these great minds working on really interesting particle physics experiments, but they weren't focusing on what I saw was the biggest challenge, which is how do we ensure we've got a livable planet for future generations? And I kind of became more and more disillusioned with trying to find dark matter or any of these really interesting questions,
Mm.
which I would still love to find an answer for, but I think we've got bigger problems to worry about right now. So I was kind of, you know, staying up at night trying to think about how can we remove carbon from the atmosphere. And I found the predecessor to Undo had a very clear brand message and a very clear company direction. And I inquired to see if they had any jobs going, and that's where I kind of joined about 3 years ago now, maybe a bit more. Um, but I do think that you have to pick the technology very carefully. There are many different technologies which seem great from the outset, but when you really dig in, they are only slowing down the decarbonisation goal. They're potentially a smoke street screen for fossil fuel companies to carry on with what they were doing before, just with slightly lower profits. And that's not a technology I want to work on. I want to work on one that will actually solve some of the problems that we have.
What sort of technologies are you thinking of there?
Um, Kind of CCUS, where it's kind of carbon capture and utilization storage,
Mm.
which maybe seems great on paper, but when you look at the capital expenditure and the ongoing costs, you'd be better just trying to decarbonize that technology,
So it's
especially
not
if
so
it
much that it doesn't work, it's just that it's not cost effective.
exactly, yeah. I think there's quite a few reports that have come out recently to show that the money would be better spent on actual decarbonization rather than trying to capture the CO2 that's leaving the process, and then maybe just using that compressed carbon for um, enhanced oil recovery or something like that. So
Yeah.
I I think when I explain to people what I do, there's already that kind of preconceived conception that oh maybe it's not that useful, maybe you'd be better spending time elsewhere. Um, so I think there are technologies like that that are kind of bringing down the space a bit, and that's where you really have to separate
Mm.
that from CDR. Like CDR on its own is removing atmospheric CO2, not just slightly reducing the amount that you're emitting anyway.
Carbon dioxide
Um,
removal, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, well, thank you so much for coming on to speak to me about this, and hopefully people will have got learned a few things about enhanced weathering from it. Certainly super interesting, and it's fantastic that you're scaling so quickly. Um, as obviously, as you say, it's such an important method of carbon removal. But yeah, thanks, Will.
yeah.
Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you very much for your time.